All right, I got a guy on the phone who claims he's been killing prostitutes and he's wondering why he's doing it. Ed?
No, this isn't Ed.
Oh.
You haven't killed any prostitutes?
No, I never said my name was Ed. You can call me Clay.
So what happened? How many prostitutes have you killed?
12.
And you're wondering why you do it?
I have a pretty good idea.
Did your mom beat you?
Was your mom a prostitute?
No, I think I just do it for the sense of the power.
Do you have sex with them first?
Yes, and
And then what, you strangle them?
once.
How else did you kill them?
Well, a few times, actually most times with a hammer.
And where do you do this primarily?
I've done it twice in a parking garage, and then the rest of the times on the side of the road.
Dude, you got to have a lot of anger in you.
Yes.
Dude, you're a serial killer.
This real call that you just heard was not out of the ordinary for the Howard Stern show. He often received calls from people with crazy stories that would end up being a hoax. But as this conversation progressed, and the tone went from a light comedic one to a more serious confession, it became clear to Howard, and also the listeners, that they were actually talking to a serial killer. The next day, Howard told his listeners that the FBI had come to the studio asking for a tape of the call. Their suspicion was that this man who had said his name was Clay was connected to what they referred to as the Storyville Slayer. They believed that the man who had talked to Howard was Russell Elwood. He was plagued by drug addiction, and he had no permanent residence. He eventually became a cab driver, and when he couldn't afford housing, he would sleep in his cab. Because of his addiction, he was in and out of jail. It doesn't seem like he was a man who tried to get better. Not having steady income also makes it hard to have any roots planted to settle. But even though he had become no stranger to brushes with the law, it wasn't until 1994 in Hahnville, Louisiana, that Russell attracted real scrutiny. Russell was stopped on the side of the road in an unlit area. When the police caught Russell, he was in the middle of an illegal act, lewd conduct, and indecent exposure. What police found especially troubling was that they had found him in his car in this unlit area, parked on the side of the road, right near where 2 bodies had been found. Russell was told to get out of his car and show his driver's license. The explanation Russell gave for being stopped on the side of the road was that he had to change the oil and repair the brake pads of his car. This was peculiar because it was night. He willingly allowed his vehicle to be searched, and when the police didn't find any of the items that Russell would need, not even a flashlight, if he was indeed fixing his car, they knew that there was no way he could be telling the truth. Police then questioned Russell about the bodies of Cheryl Lewis and Dolores Mack. Those were the names of the 2 bodies closest to where Russell was stopped. But unfortunately, they weren't just worried about these 2 women. Since the summer of 1991, the police had been searching for the Storyville Slayer. This person that they were searching for had been targeting mainly Black girls and women between the ages of 17 and 42. But because none of the crimes were happening in the same places, and the fact that these bodies were often left in water for weeks or even years before being found, it resulted in extreme decomposition and the destruction of incriminating evidence. So, finding the person responsible had been near impossible. Police questioned Russell regarding the murders, but after the initial questioning, he was released because there wasn't enough evidence yet to charge him. I totally get it. Innocent until proven guilty. But his story doesn't add up. So, in 1995, to further investigate these deaths, a task force was assembled by the New Orleans Police Department in conjunction with surrounding parishes and the FBI. By the time of assembly, the task force had 2 suspects. The first one, a man named Victor Gantt, who was a native of New Orleans, specifically Algiers, where a number of the victims had lived. Victor was a police officer, and while on the clock, he spent a lot of his time patrolling red light districts. As years passed, he became acquaintances with a lot of the pimps and prostitutes in the area. He gained a reputation for being corrupt after a number of people reported that he, along with a few others, were running racketeering operations against pimps and other criminals. While Victor was involved in the illegal operations, he met a woman named Sharon Robinson, and she became his roommate. On December 9th, 1994, Sharon went to the police to report that Victor had beat her. In her statement, she said that he punched her in the face and broke her nose. Victor denied this, but stated that he had pushed her during an argument and that she hit her nose on a chair. His statement was then contradicted by Sharon's children, who said that they had witnessed Victor beat their mother. And then their claim was backed up by the emergency room doctor, who testified that the woman's injuries were the result of a beating. A few years prior to Sharon reporting Victor's abuse, a woman had come forward about an attempt on her life. She gave a description of a man that matched Victor's. The woman had gotten into a car with an unknown man in Algiers. The incident had occurred sometime in July of 1991. And according to her testimony, after having a conversation with this man, he strangled her until she was unconscious and then dropped off her body in the street. So to recap, Victor is involved in illegal activities, and he's also a man of interest who has now been accused of abuse. In early 1995, a disciplinary panel and hearing was held to determine Victor's punishment. The key witness in this hearing was supposed to be Sharon Robinson, but on April 30th, 1995, just 4 months after she had reported Victor's abuse, her body was found in a swampy area near the I-55. Sharon's body was discovered next to the remains of a young woman named Karen Ivester. An autopsy determined that Karen had been strangled and Sharon had been beaten and strangled. Investigators believed that Victor had killed both Sharon and her friend Karen in order to get rid of them. Victor was ordered to submit DNA for testing to see whether it matched the saliva that had been found on the chewing tobacco near Karen's body. The results were inconclusive and no charges were filed. Ultimately, he was dismissed from the police force. It seemed very plausible that Victor could be responsible for all of the tragedies. But the task force had no evidence tying him to any of the other killings, and on July 23rd, 1997, they went back to Russell, who had been living with his elderly father in Florida, and questioned him once more. During the 3 days of questioning, Russell gave several statements recorded on tape that seemed to implicate him further. He admitted to frequenting black prostitutes throughout his life. In addition to this, he admitted to frequently taking hard throughout the years. The investigators became increasingly suspicious when Russell started speaking about a dream he had in which he was being questioned about a series of murders by the serial killer task force. He admitted to frequenting the locations where the bodies had been found, but he continued to claim his innocence. Days after the interrogations were complete, Russell was arrested for buying drugs from an undercover police officer at the home he shared with his father. Once Russell was convicted, he was sentenced to 85 days in the county jail. While there, a few instances were reported that would further implicate Russell as being the Storyville slayer. Multiple witnesses said that Russell was involved in a fight with another inmate. During this fight, he made a comment saying, "Yeah, I killed her, and I'll kill you too." Then an inmate named Stephen Michael Busser came forward and told the police that Russell had boasted to him that he was wanted for more than 60 murders within the state of Louisiana, even going so far as describing one in detail to him. But there was still no concrete evidence to hold him after the initial 85 days. After Russell's release and move to Ohio, one of Russell's cellmates, Stan Hill, contacted the county prosecutor's office and claimed that Russell had described to him in detail how he had driven the women that were his victims to outlying areas of the city, offering them large quantities of drugs that then caused them to overdose. And once unconscious, he would strangle and dump their bodies. I guess at this point it's all hearsay, but there seems to be a lot of things adding up that point to him. Based on this new information, the task force once again tracked Russell down to re-interview him. In the presence of Ron Camden, who was a 27-year-old veteran out of the Cincinnati Police Department's homicide unit, Russell initially denied making any such statements to the inmates, but after an audio tape of Stan Hill's testimony was played, he did admit to saying it. Ron Camden later testified that Russell had made a confession to him that he had killed a black girl and that he had dumped her in the canal. But Ron had no recording of this conversation, and Russell denied ever saying that to him. But then he did end up claiming that he had a mental illness which caused him to boast about everything. He demanded that these interrogations stop and he be allowed to return to New Orleans to see his attorney and to seek treatment for his mental illness. His request was denied. So, as the interrogations continued, Russell confessed again, but he refused to be taped, and quickly after his confession, he began denying that he had ever said any of it. Russell was eventually let go because there was still not enough evidence to detain him longer. In January of the next year, he was stopped for speeding. He was scheduled to appear in court, but failed to appear on time and was arrested for contempt of court. Russell was eventually convicted and ordered to spend 120 days in jail. While there, he was charged with the murders of Cheryl Lewis and Dolores Mack. Russell's trial didn't begin until June 8, 1999. His former cellmates and multiple prostitutes came forward and testified as witnesses. His cellmates said that Russell had made multiple confessions to them about the killings. The prostitutes claimed that Russell had physically assaulted them. Diane Gilliam, who was a former prostitute, told the court that she had dated Russell off and on since the early 90s. She testified that in 1992, while on a date, Russell was under the influence and assaulted her until she was unconscious. When she came to, she said that she was in a pool of her own blood and an area in the woods that she didn't recognize. She said that she did not report the incident because she was a prostitute with a criminal record. Another former prostitute and stripper named Navasa Richmond testified that she had also been physically assaulted twice by Russell. Janie Stokes, who was a former prostitute, testified that after meeting Russell, he took her to lunch and drove her to his house. He suggested drugs, and after they both participated, Russell started to beat her. She managed to flee. But Janie also felt like she could never report the incident because of her involvement in illegal activities and her own addiction issues. 3 witnesses then testified that they had seen Russell with Cheryl Lewis right before she had disappeared. How horrible that so many women were silenced out of fear, and yet Russell was able to keep doing whatever he wanted. Russell's attorneys then asked for a polygraph test to be performed on the then head of the task force, Sue Rushing. This request was granted. During the test, Sue was unable to answer a series of questions regarding Russell's missing documentation, so the result of her questioning was inconclusive. Ultimately, the murder charge for Dolores Mack was dropped. There just wasn't enough evidence against Russell to be charged for that. However, Russell was found guilty of killing Cheryl Lewis, and he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. As of November 2021, all of the murders, aside from Cheryl Lewis, remain unsolved. So, even though Russell Elwood was convicted and remains a suspect, there was never enough evidence linking him to any other women. Victor left New Orleans after he was discharged from law enforcement and moved to Atlanta, Georgia. Along with Russell, Victor still remains a suspect. And that's the story of the Storyville Slayer. How frustrating to know that there are so many unsolved cases. It is believed that at least 24 lives were taken, but presumably more. Thank you for watching Killer Bites.